The screaming of twisted metal against desert rock should have been the last sound Captain Sarah "Tank" Mitchell heard. Instead, as her damaged A-10 Thunderbolt skidded across the Afghan mountainside, hydraulics failing and engine number 2, bleeding black smoke into the thin air, she found herself thinking about her grandmother's old sewing machine. The one that never quite worked right, but somehow always managed to finish the job when everything else fell apart. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Bagram Airfield as Captain Sarah Mitchell walked the flight line, her worn flight boots crunching against the gravel that seemed to coat everything in this corner of Afghanistan. The air was already thick with heat and the smell of jet fuel, promising another scorching day in the Hindu Kush Mountains. Sarah pulled her baseball cap lower over her eyes and continued her pre-dawn ritual of checking every A-10 Warthog on the ramp, even the ones that weren't assigned to her. Especially the ones that weren't assigned to her. Aircraft 78065-4 sat at the far end of the line, its nose pointed toward the mountains like a faithful dog waiting for a command that might never come. The Thunderbolt's twin engines were silent, its distinctive straight wings heavy with the weight of inaction. Sarah knew this particular bird better than most pilots knew their own aircraft, despite the fact that she'd never been officially assigned to fly it. For 6 months, she'd been watching it deteriorate under the Afghan sun while higher priority missions claimed the newer, more reliable Warthogs. "Morning, Tank," came a voice from behind her. Staff Sergeant Luis Rodriguez emerged from the maintenance hangar, coffee mug in one hand and a clipboard thick with work orders in the other. Luis was one of the few people on base who used Sarah's call sign without a trace of mockery. To most of the squadron, Tank wasn't a reference to her aircraft or her methodical approach to flying. It was a barely disguised comment about her build, her personality, and her apparent inability to fit the sleek fighter pilot image that dominated military aviation culture. "Morning, Luis," Sarah replied, running her hand along the A-10's weathered fuselage. "How's our patient today?" Luis shook his head with the weary expression of a mechanic who'd seen too many good aircraft slowly die from neglect. "Hydraulic systems still leaking, port engines running rough, and the flight computers throwing intermittent errors. Colonel Peterson keeps saying she'd get proper maintenance time after the next deployment cycle." He took a long sip of coffee and added quietly, "We both know what that means." What it meant was that 78065-4 would continue to sit at the bottom of the priority list, cannibalized for parts to keep other aircraft flying, until eventually it would be written off as beyond economical repair. The Air Force called it resource optimization. Luis called it criminal negligence. Sarah called it typical. The sound of approaching voices cut through the morning air, and Sarah recognized the confident drawl of Major Kyle Viper Harrison even before she turned around. Harrison was everything the Air Force wanted in a pilot: tall, handsome, articulate, and blessed with the kind of natural flying ability that made difficult maneuvers look effortless. He was also the kind of person who treated aircraft assignments like parking spaces, taking whichever one was newest and most capable without giving thought to the machinery he left behind. Well, if it isn't Tank playing mechanic again," Harrison said as he approached with his usual entourage of wingmen. Captain Mike Torch Sullivan and Captain Danny Blade Chen flanked him like bodyguards, their flight suits pristine and their attitudes matching their leader's casual arrogance. "You know, Mitchell, there's a reason we have enlisted personnel to handle maintenance. Officers are supposed to focus on more important things." Sarah straightened up slowly, her expression remaining neutral despite the familiar sting of condescension. "Just familiarizing myself with the equipment, sir," she said evenly. "You never know when knowledge of aircraft systems might come in handy." Sullivan snorted with amusement. "Systems knowledge? Tank, you've been here 6 months and you're..." Still flying training sorties while the rest of us are running actual combat missions. Maybe worry less about hydraulic lines and more about learning how to fly like you mean it. The comment was designed to sting, and it did. Sarah had indeed been assigned primarily to training flights, orientation missions for new pilots, and the occasional low-priority reconnaissance sortie that didn't require the skills of a real combat pilot. Her personnel file was filled with evaluations that praised her technical knowledge and methodical approach while simultaneously damning her with faint praise about her lack of aggressive instincts and hesitation to push aircraft to their operational limits. What her evaluators didn't understand was that Sarah's methodical approach came from a different philosophy entirely. While other pilots saw aircraft as tools to be pushed to their breaking point in pursuit of mission success, Sarah saw them as partners to be understood, respected, and protected. She'd grown up on a farm in Nebraska, where equipment failures could mean the difference between a successful harvest and financial ruin. Her father had taught her that machines had personalities, quirks, and limits that had to be respected if you wanted them to perform when everything was on the line. Maybe, Chun added with a grin that didn't reach his eyes, Tank should stick to what she's good at. I hear the supply depot needs someone to inventory spare parts. Seems like a perfect fit for someone who's more interested in maintenance than flying. Louis stepped forward slightly, his expression darkening. As the senior enlisted mechanic on the line, he'd seen enough pilots come and go to recognize the difference between good-natured ribbing and calculated cruelty. Gentlemen, he said carefully, Captain Mitchell knows these aircraft better than anyone on this base. When you're dealing with 30-year-old warthogs in this environment, that knowledge can save lives. Harrison waved off the comment dismissively. Spare me the lecture, Sergeant. I've been flying A-10s for 8 years, and I can tell you that combat effectiveness comes from aggressive tactics and superior piloting skills, not from memorizing technical manuals. He turned to look directly at Sarah, his smile sharp as a blade. Some people are natural warriors, and some people are support personnel. Nothing wrong with knowing your limitations. The group moved on toward the newer aircraft, their laughter and casual conversation fading into the distance. Sarah remained by 780654, running her hand along its wing and feeling the familiar weight of being dismissed settle on her shoulders like an old coat. Luis stood beside her, his coffee growing cold in his hands. You know they're wrong, right? He said quietly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. About you, about this bird, about everything. Sarah managed a small smile. Doesn't matter what I know, Luis. What matters is what Colonel Peterson thinks when assignment time comes around. She gestured toward the departing pilots. And they've got his ear. What Sarah didn't mention was the folder hidden in her quarters, filled with technical specifications, maintenance records, and performance data that she'd been compiling for months. While Harrison and his wingmen spent their off-duty time at the officers' club sharing war stories and planning their next conquests, Sarah had been studying every A-10 ever built, learning the subtle differences between aircraft, understanding how years of combat stress affected airframe performance, and developing an almost supernatural ability to predict mechanical problems before they occurred. She'd also been running unauthorized training scenarios in the base flight simulator, practicing emergency procedures that weren't part of the standard curriculum. Engine failures at low altitude, hydraulic system malfunctions during combat maneuvers, electrical fires in hostile airspace, the kinds of situations that most pilots hoped they'd never encounter and therefore never bothered to practice. Sarah practiced them religiously because she understood something that the others didn't. In combat aviation, it wasn't the routine missions that defined the pilot's worth. It was the impossible missions, the emergency situations, the moments when everything went wrong and only knowledge, skill, and unshakable calm could bring everyone home alive. The briefing room at 0800 was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and the nervous energy that preceded every combat mission assignment. Sarah sat in her usual spot in the back row, notebook open and pen ready, while the squadron's more senior pilots occupied the front seats like nobility at court. Colonel Peterson stood at the front of the room, his weathered face serious as he reviewed the day's mission board. "Gentlemen and lady," Peterson began, nodding briefly in Sarah's direction, "we've got a significant tasking today. Intelligence indicates high-value target movement in the Korangal Valley, and higher headquarters wants immediate interdiction before they can reach the Pakistani border." The room's energy shifted as pilots sat up straighter, recognizing the kind of mission that could make careers. The Korangal Valley was notorious among coalition forces as one of the most dangerous pieces of real estate in Afghanistan. A narrow canyon where Taliban forces had perfected the art of using terrain to neutralize American technological advantages. "Major Harrison," Peterson continued, "you'll lead the primary strike package. 4 aircraft, full combat load, coordinated with ground controllers from the 10th Mountain Division." Harrison straightened with visible pride as Peterson outlined the mission parameters: high priority target, significant enemy presence, maximum opportunity for distinction. "Sullivan and Chun, you're Harrison's wingmen. Captain Rodriguez will fly number 4. Peterson's finger moved across the tactical display, marking ingress routes and target areas with practiced precision. "Time on target is 1400 hours, which gives you plenty of daylight for positive target identification and battle damage assessment." Sarah felt the familiar pang of being excluded from the real action, but she kept her expression neutral and continued taking notes. She'd learned long ago that reacting to disappointment only provided ammunition for those who wanted to see her fail. "Captain Mitchell," Peterson said, almost as an afterthought, "you'll be running airfield security patrol. Single aircraft, defensive posture, maintain communication with tower control." He gestured toward a small circle drawn on the edge of the tactical map, far from any of the day's significant action. "Keep an eye on approach corridors and make sure we don't have any uninvited guests while the main force is engaged." The assignment was exactly what Sarah had expected. Important enough to require a qualified pilot, routine enough that failure would be difficult, and isolated enough that success would go unnoticed. She was being assigned to fly circles around the base while the real pilots went out and fought the real war. "Sir," she said quietly, "what aircraft am I assigned?" Peterson consulted his clipboard with the expression of someone dealing with minor administrative details. "Tail number 780654. I know it's not our newest bird, but it's adequate for defensive patrol work." The irony was almost too perfect. Sarah was being assigned to fly the broken-down Warthog that no one else wanted, on a mission that no one else considered important, while staying safely away from any situation where her supposed limitations might matter. It was the aviation equivalent of being sent to guard the supply depot. Harrison turned in his seat with a knowing smirk. "Try not to break anything, Tank. Some of us might need that aircraft when we get back from doing the real flying." The comment earned chuckles from his wingman and a few other pilots who enjoyed seeing the squadron's outlier reminded of her place in the pecking order. Sarah simply nodded and continued writing in her notebook, documenting details that others considered irrelevant. What they didn't know was that Sarah had been preparing for exactly this kind of assignment for months. While they saw 780654 as a liability, she saw it as an opportunity to prove that mechanical reliability mattered more than flashy performance. While they viewed airfield security as busy work, she understood that defensive operations required a different kind of tactical thinking, patient, methodical, and absolutely crucial when things went wrong. As the briefing concluded and pilots began filing out to prepare for their missions, Sarah remained in her seat, studying the tactical map with unusual intensity. Louise approached from the back of the room, where he'd been listening to the mission assignments with growing concern. "Tank," he said quietly, "I need to talk to you about 654. Sarah looked up from her map, recognizing the tone of voice that meant serious mechanical issues. "What's wrong with her today?" Louise glanced around to make sure they were alone, then leaned closer. "Hydraulic leaks gotten worse overnight. Flight computers throwing error codes I've never seen before. And this morning I found metal shavings in the oil filter that suggest bearing problems in the port engine." He paused, his expression grim. "Honestly, if this bird belonged to any other pilot, I'd red tag it as unsafe for flight." Red tagging meant grounding the aircraft until major repairs could be completed, effectively removing it from service for weeks or possibly months. For any other pilot, such a recommendation would be routine maintenance procedure. For Sarah, it would mean missing her only opportunity to fly a combat mission in weeks. "How bad is it really?" she asked, her voice steady despite the implications. Louise ran his hand through his graying hair, a gesture Sarah recognized as his way of wrestling with difficult decisions. "Bad enough that you'll be flying on borrowed time. The hydraulics might hold together for a routine patrol, but if you have to maneuver hard or take any kind of damage—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Sarah studied the maintenance chief's weathered face, seeing years of experience and genuine concern for pilot safety. Louise had been keeping broken aircraft flying in hostile environments since before she was commissioned, and his judgment was usually flawless. If he was worried about 780654, the smart move would be to accept his recommendation and find another aircraft. The problem was that there wasn't another aircraft. The squadron's newer Warthogs were already assigned to Harrison's strike package, and the remaining aircraft were either down for scheduled maintenance or configured for specialized missions. That didn't include airfield security patrol. Refusing to fly 780654 would mean staying on the ground while others flew combat missions, adding another entry to her personnel file, suggesting that she lacked the aggressive instincts necessary for combat aviation. "Louise," she said carefully, "if you were flying this mission, what would you do?" The question put him in an impossible position. As a maintenance chief, his job was to ensure aircraft safety. As someone who'd watched Sarah struggle against institutional bias for months, he understood the professional implications of grounding her only available aircraft. "If I were flying this mission," he said slowly, "I'd want to know everything that could go wrong, and I'd have backup plans for all of it." He pulled out a worn notebook and flipped to a page covered with technical diagrams. "The hydraulic leak is in the primary system, but the backup system is solid. If you lose primary hydraulics, you'll have reduced control authority, but the aircraft will still fly." Sarah leaned forward, studying the diagrams with the intensity of someone whose life might depend on understanding every detail. "What about the engine problems?" "Port engines developing bearing noise, which means it's running hotter than normal and using more oil. If you baby it and avoid high power settings, it should last for a routine patrol." Luce's expression grew more serious. "But if you have to use military power for any extended period, that engine could seize without warning." The technical briefing continued for 20 minutes, covering every system on the aircraft and every possible failure mode. By the time Louise finished, Sarah had filled 6 pages of her notebook with detailed information about aircraft limitations, emergency procedures, and backup plans for situations that probably wouldn't occur during a routine defensive patrol. "One more thing," Louise said as he closed his notebook. "The flight computer errors are intermittent, which means your navigation and weapon systems might glitch at random intervals. I've reset the system 3 times, but the problems keep coming back." Sarah nodded, adding the computer issues to her growing list of concerns. "Anything else I should know?" Louise was quiet for a moment, then looked directly into her eyes. "Tank, this aircraft is held together with determination and prayer. It shouldn't be flying combat missions, but it's what we've got." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "If anyone can keep that bird flying when everything goes wrong, it's you. Just be careful out there." As Sarah walked toward the flight line to begin her pre-flight inspection, she reflected on the irony of her situation. The other pilots saw her assignment as punishment, flying a broken aircraft on a meaningless mission while they handled the real combat operations. What they didn't understand was that Sarah had been preparing her entire career for exactly this kind of challenge, making the impossible work, keeping broken things flying, and finding ways to succeed when failure seemed inevitable. The pre-flight inspection of 780654 took twice as long as normal, with Sarah examining every system, connection, and component that Louise had identified as problematic. The hydraulic leak was visible as a thin line of red fluid on the concrete beneath the aircraft, and the port engine's oil consumption was evident from the black stains around the exhaust nozzle. The flight computer's errors manifested as flickering displays and occasional warning lights that appeared and disappeared without explanation. Any reasonable pilot would have walked away from such an aircraft. Sarah strapped herself into the cockpit and began the startup sequence with the methodical precision of someone who understood that attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. As the engine spooled up, the port engine's bearing noise was clearly audible even through her helmet. The hydraulic system warning light illuminated briefly during the system check, then extinguished as backup systems compensated for the primary system's deficiencies. The navigation display flickered twice before stabilizing on what Sarah hoped were accurate readings. "Bagram Tower, Hog 01 ready for taxi," she transmitted, using the call sign assigned to her solo patrol mission. "Hog 01, taxi to runway 03. Window 80 at 12 knots, altimeter 2992. As Sarah taxied toward the runway, she passed Harrison's four-ship formation, preparing for their strike mission. The newer A-10s gleamed in the afternoon sun, their systems functioning perfectly and their pilots radiating confidence about the successful mission ahead. Harrison caught sight of her through his canopy and offered a mocking salute, a gesture that managed to convey both false respect and genuine dismissal. Sarah returned the salute professionally and continued toward her assigned runway, trying not to think about the fact that she was about to take off in an aircraft that probably shouldn't be flying, to execute a mission that nobody considered important. While the rest of her squadron headed off to write the next chapter in their combat aviation careers. Hog 01, cleared for takeoff. Sarah advanced the throttles carefully, monitoring engine parameters as 780654 accelerated down the runway. The port engine's temperatures climbed higher than normal, and the hydraulic pressure fluctuated ominously, but the aircraft lifted off smoothly and climbed toward its assigned patrol altitude. As Bagram Airfield fell away beneath her, Sarah activated her radio and checked in with the Air Traffic Control Center that would monitor her patrol route. "Bagram Control, Hog 01 airborne, proceeding to Patrol Area Alpha. Hog 01 copy. Maintain assigned altitude and report any significant contacts." The afternoon sun slanted through her canopy as Sarah settled into the rhythm of defensive patrol, flying slow circles around the airfield while monitoring radio frequencies and scanning the sky for threats that probably wouldn't materialize. It was exactly the kind of routine, unglamorous mission that defined her military career, necessary but unremarkable, professional but invisible. What Sarah didn't know was that 150 miles to the north, Harrison's strike package was flying into a carefully planned ambush that would test every pilot's skills, reveal the limitations of perfect aircraft flown by imperfect tacticians, and create a situation where the Air Force's most overlooked pilot would become its only hope for bringing everyone home alive. The first indication that something had gone wrong came through the emergency frequency, a burst of static followed by Harrison's voice. tight with stress and barely controlled panic. "Mayday, mayday, Viper flight lead is down. Repeat, Viper flight lead is down. We've got survivors on the ground and hostiles converging on position. Any station, we need immediate extraction support." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice as the implications hit her. Harrison's supposedly routine strike mission had turned into a nightmare, with aircraft down and pilots trapped behind enemy lines. The professional distance she'd maintained toward her squadron mates evaporated instantly, replaced by the fundamental military principle that you never leave anyone behind. As more details emerged through scattered radio transmissions, Sarah began to understand the scope of the disaster. Harrison's A-10 had been shot down by small arms fire while making a low-altitude attack run, and he was trapped in terrain that made helicopter extraction impossible. Sullivan and Chun were still airborne but low on fuel and ammunition, unable to provide effective cover for a rescue operation. Rodriguez had taken battle damage and was limping back toward base, his aircraft barely controllable. The nearest rescue assets were hours away, and Taliban forces were already moving toward Harrison's position. Without immediate intervention, the Air Force was about to lose one of its most decorated pilots to capture or worse. Sarah keyed her radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Bagram Control, Hago-1 requests permission to depart patrol area and provide support for downed pilot." The response came back immediately, tinged with uncertainty and bureaucratic caution. "Hago-1, negative, maintain assigned patrol pattern. Search and rescue assets are being tasked to handle the situation." It was the safe answer, the politically correct response that would protect everyone involved from criticism if things went wrong. It was also a death sentence for Harrison, because Sarah knew exactly how long it would take for proper rescue assets to reach the Korangal Valley, and she knew that Taliban forces moved much faster than American bureaucracy. As she continued flying her assigned patrol pattern, Sarah listened to the radio chatter painting an increasingly desperate picture. Sullivan and Chun were burning through their remaining fuel trying to provide air cover for Harrison's position, but they were being forced to operate at high altitude to avoid the concentrated anti-aircraft fire that had brought down their leader. From their altitude, they couldn't provide the close air support that might keep enemy forces away from the crash site. "Any station monitoring this frequency," Sullivan transmitted, his voice cracking with exhaustion and stress. "Viper lead is injured and surrounded. We need low-altitude support aircraft with extended loiter capability. Our fuel state is critical and will be forced to depart the area in 15 minutes." Sarah looked down at her fuel gauges and engine parameters, making rapid calculations about her aircraft's capabilities and limitations. The Korangal Valley was at the absolute limit of her operational range, especially considering her port engine's problems and increased fuel consumption. A round trip would require precise fuel management and perfect execution of every phase of flight. More importantly, providing effective close air support for a trapped pilot would require exactly the kind of aggressive, low-altitude flying that Lees had warned her to avoid. The hydraulic problems meant reduced control authority during high-G maneuvers. The engine problems meant vulnerability to ground fire that might require emergency power settings. The flight computer glitches meant potential navigation and weapon system failures at the worst possible moments. It was exactly the kind of mission that 780654 wasn't capable of handling, flown by a pilot that the Air Force didn't trust with important assignments, in support of someone who'd spent months making sure everyone knew she didn't belong in combat. Aviation. Sarah made her decision with the same methodical precision that had defined her entire career. She contacted Bagram Control one more time, formally requesting permission to depart her patrol area and provide support for the rescue operation. When permission was denied again, she acknowledged the transmission, switched her radio to the emergency frequency, and turned her broken A-10 toward the mountains. Torchflight, this is Hog 01, she transmitted calmly. I'm en route to your position with full combat load. ETA your area in 40 minutes. The silence that followed was broken by Sullivan's disbelieving voice. Hog 01, say again? Did you just say you're coming to help? Affirmative, Torchflight. Departing patrol area now, proceeding direct to grid coordinates provided. What happened next would be discussed in military academies for decades. How the Air Force's most overlooked pilot took its most broken aircraft into one of the most dangerous pieces of airspace in Afghanistan and brought everyone home alive using tactics that rewrote the book on combat aviation. But first, she had to get there. And getting there meant flying 780-654 farther, faster, and harder than the aircraft had any right to go, while keeping systems functioning that should have failed hours ago. As Sarah banked toward the Hindu Kush Mountains, she felt the familiar weight of being underestimated settle on her shoulders like armor. For once in her career, that weight felt like an advantage. No one expected her to succeed, which meant no one would be prepared for what she was about to do. The real fight was about to begin, and Sarah "Tank" Mitchell was finally going to show the world what quiet competence could accomplish when everything was on the line. The Hindu Kush Mountains rose like jagged teeth against the afternoon sky. As Sarah pushed 780-654 through the thin air at maximum sustainable power, every minute of 40-minute flight to the Koringal Valley was a delicate balance between speed and mechanical survival, with Sarah constantly monitoring engine temperatures, hydraulic pressure, and fuel consumption while navigating through some of the most dangerous airspace in Afghanistan. The port engine's bearing noise had grown noticeably worse since takeoff, creating a subtle vibration that transmitted through the airframe like a heartbeat with an irregular rhythm. Sarah had reduced power settings to the minimum necessary for sustained flight, but even conservative throttle management couldn't hide the fact that the engine was slowly destroying itself. Louise had estimated that the bearings might last for a routine patrol mission, but sustained high-power operation would almost certainly result in catastrophic failure. Torchflight, Hog 01, Sarah transmitted as she crossed into the Koringal Valley airspace. On station in 2 minutes. Request. Current tactical situation. Sullivan's voice crackled through the static exhaustion and stress evident in every word. Hog 01. Viper lead is on the deck, approximately 3 clicks northeast of Checkpoint Bravo. We've got confirmed enemy movement from multiple directions. Estimate 20 to 30 hostiles converging on crash site. Our fuel state is critical. Will be forced to depart your area in 10 minutes maximum. Sarah consulted her map, correlating Sullivan's position reports with the terrain features visible through her canopy. The Koringal Valley was a nightmare of steep ridges, narrow draws, and limited maneuvering room. Exactly the kind of environment where Taliban forces excelled at using terrain to negate American technological advantages. Worse, the crash site appeared to be in a bowl-shaped depression surrounded by high ground, meaning that any aircraft providing close air support would be vulnerable to fire from multiple directions. Copy, Torchflight. What's Viper lead's condition? Unknown at this time. We've had intermittent radio contact, but his last transmission indicated possible leg injury and limited mobility. Enemy forces are approximately 15 minutes out from his position. 15 minutes. Sarah felt the familiar cold clarity that came with impossible deadlines and overwhelming odds. In 15 minutes, Harrison would either be rescued, captured, or killed, and the responsibility for determining which outcome occurred was now resting squarely on her shoulders. The irony wasn't lost on her that the pilot who'd spent months dismissing her capabilities was now depending entirely on those same capabilities for his survival. Torchflight, Hog 01 is taking tactical control of this airspace. Recommend you depart for fuel and rearmament. I'll maintain overwatch until additional assets arrive. There was a long pause before Sullivan responded. clearly struggling with the implications of leaving a downed pilot under the protection of the squadron's most inexperienced combat pilot flying the unit's least reliable aircraft. Military protocol dictated that he should maintain position as long as physically possible, but fuel consumption was an unforgiving master that didn't recognize good intentions. Hogo 1, are you sure you can handle this alone? This isn't exactly a training scenario. The question stung more than Sarah cared to admit, carrying as it did the assumption that she was somehow less capable than other pilots of executing complex combat operations. But this wasn't the time for wounded pride or defensive responses. Harrison's life depended on her maintaining absolute focus on the tactical situation, rather than the personal dynamics that had brought her to this moment. Torch flight, I'm sure. See you back at base. As Sullivan and Chun turned southeast toward Bagram, their afterburners briefly visible against the mountain backdrop, Sarah found herself truly alone over one of the most hostile pieces of terrain. On Earth, the radio chatter that had filled her headset for the past hour faded away, replaced by the subtle sounds of her aircraft systems and the whisper of wind over wings that had been designed for exactly this kind of low-altitude, close support. Mission. Sarah descended toward the valley floor, using ridgelines and terrain features to mask her approach while scanning for both Harrison's position and the enemy forces that were undoubtedly moving toward him. The flight computer's intermittent errors made navigation challenging, with GPS coordinates occasionally jumping by several hundred meters before correcting themselves. She'd learned to cross-reference electronic navigation with visual landmarks, a skill that most modern pilots had never developed, but which now proved invaluable. Viper lead, Hog 01, she transmitted on the emergency frequency. I'm overhead. Your area, request position confirmation, and status report. Harrison's voice came back weak and strained, clearly broadcasting from a survival radio with limited range and battery life. Hog 01, where the hell is everybody? I've been calling for support for over an hour. Viper lead, Torch flight. Departed for fuel. I'm here to provide overwatch until additional assets arrive. Can you confirm your grid coordinates? There was a long pause, followed by Harrison's voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and barely contained panic. Wait, Tank? They sent Tank to rescue me. Where are the real pilots? The comment hit Sarah like a physical blow, even under the current circumstances. Here was a man whose life hung in the balance, and his first reaction to learning about her presence was disappointment that someone more qualified wasn't available. It was a perfect encapsulation of everything she'd endured throughout her military career, being treated as a last resort rather than a first choice, regardless of her actual capabilities. Viper lead, I'm the pilot you've got, Sarah replied, with professional calm. Now give me your position so I can keep you alive. Harrison reluctantly provided his coordinates, and Sarah began the complex process of locating a single person in terrain that offered countless hiding places while simultaneously scanning for enemy movement. The A-10 sensors were designed for this kind of work, but 780654's aging systems required constant adjustment and interpretation. The targeting pod's thermal imaging flickered occasionally, and the radar warning receiver generated false alarms that had to be distinguished from legitimate threats. What Sarah found when she finally located Harrison's position was both better and worse than she'd expected. Better because he was alive, conscious, and appeared to be taking cover in a rocky outcropping that provided some protection from small arms fire. Worse because the enemy forces converging on his location were larger, better organized, and more heavily armed than intelligence had suggested. Through her targeting pod, Sarah counted at least 30 Taliban fighters moving in coordinated groups through the surrounding hills. They were carrying a mixture of assault rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, and what appeared to be several heavy machine guns that could pose a serious threat to low-flying aircraft. More concerning was the disciplined way they were advancing, using terrain features for concealment and maintaining communication between groups. This wasn't a random collection of insurgents stumbling across a downed pilot. This was a coordinated military operation designed to capture or kill a high-value target. Viper lead, I've got eyes on multiple hostile groups approaching your position from the north, east, and south. Estimate 25 to 30 fighters with heavy weapons. You need to move to a more defensible position. Tank, I can't move. My left leg's busted up pretty bad from the ejection, and I'm stuck in these rocks. You're going to have to keep them away from me. The tactical situation was becoming clear, and it was everything that Sarah had been preparing for during those long hours in the flight simulator. A single aircraft with limited ammunition and fuel, tasked with protecting a stationary target against overwhelming ground forces in terrain that favored the enemy. It was exactly the kind of scenario that most pilots never trained for, because it represented a level of tactical complexity that couldn't be solved through standard procedures. What made the situation even more challenging was the nature of her aircraft and its current mechanical condition. The A-10 Warthog was specifically designed for close air support missions, with heavy armor, powerful weapons, and the ability to loiter over a target area for extended periods. But those capabilities assumed an aircraft operating at full performance, with all systems functioning normally. Sarah was flying a machine that was literally falling apart, with hydraulic leaks, engine problems, and computer glitches that could prove fatal during high-stress maneuvering. More importantly, effective close air support required aggressive, low-altitude flying that would expose her aircraft to exactly the kind of ground fire that had brought down Harrison in the first place. The Taliban forces were clearly prepared for air attack, with heavy machine guns positioned to create overlapping fields of fire and RPG teams ready to engage low-flying aircraft. A single mistake, mechanical failure, or moment of inattention could turn her rescue mission into a double tragedy. Sarah spent several minutes analyzing the tactical situation, using skills that she'd developed during countless hours of studying combat reports, terrain analysis, and enemy tactics. While other pilots had focused on perfecting their bombing techniques and air-to-air combat skills, Sarah had immersed herself in the unglamorous details of asymmetric warfare, learning how insurgent forces operated and how they could be defeated by patient, methodical application of air power. The key insight that emerged from her analysis was that the Taliban forces were operating according to a predictable pattern, using the same infiltration routes and communication methods that had served them well against previous coalition operations. They expected American air power to operate in standard fashion, high-altitude bombing runs, brief periods of engagement, and withdrawal when fuel or ammunition ran low. They weren't prepared for a pilot who understood that sometimes the most effective tactic was to completely abandon conventional wisdom. Viper lead, I'm going to start engaging the northern group first. When I begin my attack run, you need to move to the rocky outcropping approximately 50 meters to your southeast. It'll provide better cover and clearer fields of fire if they get too close. Tank, I told you I can't move. My leg's completely fucked up. Viper lead, you're going to move or you're going to die. Your choice. The blunt assessment seemed to penetrate Harrison's shock and self-pity, because his next transmission carried a note of grim determination. Copy, I'll try to move when you start shooting. Sarah lined up for her first attack run, targeting the northernmost group of Taliban fighters who were advancing through a narrow draw toward Harrison's position. Standard A-10 tactics called for high speed, low-altitude passes designed to minimize exposure time while delivering maximum firepower. The problem was that 78 to 654's hydraulic problems made high-G maneuvering dangerous, and the port engine's bearing problems made sustained high power settings potentially catastrophic. Instead of a conventional attack profile, Sarah opted for something that no A-10 pilot had ever attempted in combat, a sustained, low-speed gun run that would keep her in the target area long enough to completely suppress enemy movement, while using minimal power settings to protect her failing engine. It was tactically innovative, mechanically necessary, and absolutely terrifying. Sarah rolled into a shallow dive, lining up the GA-U-8 Avenger cannon with the draw where the first group of fighters was advancing. The 30mm cannon was the A-10's primary weapon, capable of firing depleted uranium rounds at a rate of 4,200 rounds per minute. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it could turn infantry positions into smoking craters in a matter of seconds. The first burst caught the Taliban fighters completely by surprise. Sarah had approached from an unexpected angle, using a ridgeline to mask her approach until the last possible moment. The cannon's distinctive sound, like a giant piece of canvas being torn in half, echoed through the valley as 30mm rounds chewed through rocks, equipment, and anything else in their path. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. Taliban forces who had been advancing with confidence suddenly found themselves under attack from an invisible enemy, with their carefully planned assault routes turning into killing fields. Several fighters broke cover and ran for deeper terrain, while others went to ground and tried to locate the source of the devastating fire. Sarah pulled out of her gun run with careful control inputs, mindful of her hydraulic limitations while scanning for her next target. The targeting pod showed the northern group scattered and disorganized, but the eastern and southern groups were still advancing toward Harrison's position. Worse, several fighters were setting up heavy machine guns in positions that would give them clear shots at any aircraft making subsequent attack runs. "Good shooting, Tank," Harrison transmitted, genuine relief evident in his voice. "That scattered them pretty good. I'm moving to the position you indicated." As Sarah set up for her second attack run, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The Taliban forces weren't just retreating or taking cover. They were adapting to her tactics, repositioning their heavy weapons to create overlapping fields of fire that would make her next gun run much more dangerous. Worse, several RPG teams were moving to positions where they could engage her aircraft. During its most vulnerable moment, the pullout from an attack run when airspeed was low and maneuvering options were limited. It was exactly the kind of tactical adaptation that separated experienced insurgent forces from undisciplined militia, and it meant that Sarah's next attack would have to be even more innovative than her first. Standard tactics were now completely useless because the enemy had already figured out how to counter them. Sarah spent precious seconds analyzing the new tactical situation, looking for weaknesses in the enemy positions that she could exploit without exposing herself to unacceptable risk. The answer came from her months of studying historical combat reports and her deep understanding of A-10 capabilities that most pilots never bothered to learn. Instead of attacking from a predictable direction, Sarah decided to use the one tactical advantage that her broken aircraft still possessed: its ability to fly slower and lower than any other combat aircraft in the American inventory. While modern fighters were designed for speed and altitude, the A-10 had been built to operate in the weeds, flying at airspeeds and altitudes that would stall other aircraft. Sarah descended to less than 100 feet above the valley floor, using the terrain to mask her approach while flying at barely above stall speed. The technique required precise control inputs and constant attention to airspeed, but it allowed her to approach the enemy positions from an angle they hadn't anticipated and couldn't effectively counter. The second gun run was even more devastating than the first. Flying at treetop level, Sarah was able to engage multiple targets in rapid succession, using the cannon's enormous ammunition capacity to saturate enemy positions with accurate fire. The eastern group of fighters found themselves under attack before they even realized she was in the area, and several heavy machine gun positions were destroyed before they could return fire. But success came at a cost. As Sarah pulled out of her attack run, The port engine's bearing noise became a grinding roar that was audible even over the sound of wind and weapons fire. Engine temperature climbed rapidly into the red zone, and oil pressure began dropping toward dangerously low levels. Louise had been right about the engine's limitations, and Sarah had just pushed those limitations well beyond their safe margins. "Viper lead, how are you doing down there?" "Much better. Thanks to you. That last run scattered the guys coming from the east, and I made it to the rock pile you identified. I've got decent cover now and good visibility in all directions." Sarah quickly ran through her engine parameters, calculating how much longer she could continue high-power operations before mechanical failure became inevitable. The numbers weren't encouraging. Oil pressure was dropping steadily, metal temperature was climbing beyond safe limits, and the vibration from failing bearings was starting to affect her ability to aim accurately. Under normal circumstances, an engine in such condition would require immediate shutdown and emergency landing procedures. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Harrison's life still hung in the balance. The southern group of Taliban fighters was still advancing toward his position, and several scattered elements from the northern and eastern groups were beginning to regroup for another assault. "Tank, I've got movement to the south. Looks like 8 to 10 fighters with heavy weapons. They're using the stream for concealment, but they're definitely heading my way." Sarah located the southern group through her targeting pod, confirming Harrison's assessment. This group had learned from the fate of their comrades and was advancing much more cautiously, using terrain features for concealment and maintaining dispersed formations that would be harder to attack effectively. They were also carrying what appeared to be several Stinger missiles, shoulder-fired anti-aircraft, weapons that could bring down any aircraft operating at low altitude. The tactical situation had become a classic dilemma of close air support. The longer Sarah remained in the area, the more effective the enemy's air defenses became, but departing now would leave Harrison defenseless against forces that were still numerous enough to overrun his position. She needed to end the engagement decisively, which meant taking risks that her aircraft probably couldn't survive. Sarah made her decision with the same methodical precision that had characterized her entire approach to military aviation. She would make one final attack run, using every round of ammunition remaining in her cannon to destroy the southern group's cohesion and force them to retreat. If her engine held together long enough to complete the attack, she would then escort Harrison through an overland extraction to a pickup point that helicopter assets could reach safely. If her engine failed during the attack, she would crash somewhere in the valley and hope that search and rescue could find 2 pilots instead of 1. "Viper lead, I'm making one more gun run on the southern group, then we're getting you out of here. Be ready to move when I tell you." "Tank, your engine sounds like shit from down here. Are you sure you can make another run?" The observation was uncomfortably accurate. The port engine's death throes were audible even to someone on the ground, and Sarah knew that she was asking the machine to perform beyond any reasonable mechanical limits. But abandoning Harrison now would mean watching him die, and that wasn't an option she was willing to consider. "Viper lead, I'm sure. Get ready to move." Sarah lined up for her final attack run, approaching the southern group from yet another unexpected angle while flying even lower and slower than before. The technique was pushing both her aircraft and her own piloting skills to their absolute limits, but it was the only way to achieve the element of surprise necessary for a decisive engagement. As she rolled into the attack, Sarah could see Taliban fighters scrambling to bring their heavy weapons to bear on her aircraft. Several muzzle flashes indicated that they were firing assault rifles and machine guns, but at her current altitude and airspeed, their fire was largely ineffective. More concerning were the RPG teams that were trying to position themselves for shots at her aircraft during its most vulnerable phase. The final gun run lasted less than 30 seconds, but consumed every remaining round of 30mm ammunition in her aircraft's magazine. Sarah walked the cannon fire through the stream where the Taliban fighters were advancing, destroying equipment, eliminating personnel, and creating a psychological effect that would discourage any further advance. Toward Harrison's position. As she pulled out of the attack, two things happened simultaneously. The port engine seized with a grinding crash that shook the entire aircraft, and an RPG round detonated close enough to her starboard wing to pepper the aircraft with shrapnel. Sarah felt the A-10 lurch sideways as hydraulic fluid began streaming from multiple punctures, and several cockpit warning lights illuminated to indicate various system failures. "Engine fire, port side," Sarah announced calmly, beginning emergency procedures while maintaining aircraft control with rapidly degrading hydraulic systems. "Viper lead, this is going to get interesting. Start moving toward the extraction point." We discussed. "Tank, I can see smoke coming from your aircraft. How bad is it?" Sarah consulted her instruments, noting oil pressure at 0, metal temperature off the scale, and hydraulic pressure dropping rapidly. Under any reasonable definition, her aircraft was no longer airworthy and should be prepared for immediate emergency landing. The problem was that there weren't any suitable landing areas in the Korengal Valley, and ejecting would leave both pilots stranded in territory controlled by hostile forces. "Viper lead, it's manageable. Keep moving." What Sarah didn't mention was that she was now flying an aircraft with one failed engine, massive hydraulic leaks, battle damage to the starboard wing, and control systems that were becoming less responsive. With every passing minute, the A-10 had been designed to survive this kind of damage, but design margins had limits, and she was rapidly approaching them. More importantly, she was now faced with the most complex flying challenge of her career, maintaining aircraft control while navigating through mountainous terrain, coordinating Harrison's ground movement, and dealing with mechanical failures. That would challenge even the most experienced test pilots. It was exactly the kind of emergency that she'd practiced hundreds of times in the flight simulator. But simulated emergencies never included the psychological pressure of knowing that failure meant death for herself and another pilot. Sarah shut down the port engine completely, sealing fuel lines and activating fire suppression systems, while transferring all electrical and hydraulic loads to the starboard systems. The asymmetric thrust made aircraft control more difficult, but it eliminated the fire risk and simplified her emergency procedures. More challenging was the hydraulic situation, which was deteriorating rapidly as battle damage allowed precious fluid to escape faster than backup systems could compensate. "Tank, there's a clearing about 2 clicks southeast of my position," Harrison transmitted. "Looks big enough for helicopter pickup if you can keep the bad guys away long enough." Sarah evaluated the proposed extraction point through her targeting pod, noting that it offered good visibility and multiple escape routes, but was still within range of scattered Taliban forces. Getting Harrison to the clearing would require careful coordination and probably additional close air support, neither of which would be easy with her aircraft in its current condition. "Copy, Viper lead. Start moving toward that clearing, but take your time and stay in cover. I'll provide overwatch and deal with any threats that develop." As Harrison began his slow, painful movement toward the extraction point, Sarah settled into the most challenging flight of her career. With one engine failed, hydraulics leaking, and battle damage affecting aerodynamic performance, she had to maintain position over his route while remaining ready to engage any enemy forces that might threaten his movement. The next hour would test every skill she'd developed during her years of studying emergency procedures, aircraft systems, and unconventional tactics. She would have to keep a dying aircraft flying long enough to ensure Harrison's safety, coordinate with rescue assets that were still hours away, and deal with whatever surprises the Taliban forces might have in store. But for the first time in her military career, Sarah felt completely confident in her abilities. This was what she'd been preparing for all along: the impossible mission, the broken aircraft, the situation where quiet competence mattered more than flashy flying skills. She'd spent years being dismissed as inadequate for combat operations, but now she was proving that some forms of excellence couldn't be evaluated in peacetime. As Harrison disappeared into the dense vegetation covering his escape route, Sarah began the delicate process of shepherding him toward safety while keeping her aircraft flying through sheer determination and mechanical sympathy. The real test was just beginning, and everything she'd learned about flying, fighting, and refusing to give up was about to be put to the ultimate examination. The radio crackled with Harrison's labored breathing as he made his way through terrain that was designed by nature to break human spirit and bodies in equal measure. "Tank, progress is slow. This leg's worse than I thought, and I'm having to take a lot of breaks." Sarah acknowledged his transmission while scanning her instruments and the surrounding airspace. The starboard engine was running hot from carrying the entire electrical and hydraulic load. Fuel consumption was higher than normal due to asymmetric drag, and her control authority was decreasing as hydraulic pressure continued to drop. She was flying an aircraft that was systematically failing, but she was also discovering capabilities that no training manual had ever documented. What emerged from this trial by fire was a level of pilot-aircraft integration that few aviators ever achieved. Sarah found herself anticipating system failures before they occurred, compensating for control deficiencies through subtle adjustments in power and trim, and extracting performance from damaged systems that shouldn't have been possible. It was the kind of flying that couldn't be taught in any school or simulated in any trainer. It could only be learned through necessity, desperation, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. "Viper lead, you've got company," Sarah announced after spotting movement through her targeting pod. 3 individuals moving parallel to your route, approximately 400 meters to your north. They appear to be trying to get ahead of you. Harrison's response was immediate and professional, the panic and self-pity of earlier transmissions, replaced by the focused determination of a combat pilot who understood that survival required absolute clarity of thought. "Copy, can you discourage them?" Sarah evaluated her options, noting that she'd expended all of her cannon ammunition during the earlier engagement and was left with only her missiles for additional firepower. The Maverick missiles carried by the A-10 were designed for attacking armored vehicles and hardened targets, not individual personnel, but they could be effective for psychological warfare if used creatively. "Stand by, Viper lead." Sarah selected one of her remaining missiles and programmed it to detonate against a rocky outcropping approximately 50 meters from the Taliban fighters' position. The explosion wouldn't cause casualties at that range, but it would demonstrate that she was still capable of engaging ground targets and might discourage further pursuit of Harrison's position. The missile launch was picture perfect, with the weapon guiding smoothly to its programmed impact point and detonating in a spectacular fireball that echoed through the valley. The psychological effect on the Taliban fighters was immediate, with all 3 individuals abandoning their pursuit and retreating toward more defensible positions. "Nice shooting, Tank. They're definitely moving away from my route now." As Harrison continued his movement toward the extraction point, Sarah found herself dealing with an increasingly complex mechanical situation. The starboard engine was showing signs of stress from operating at high power settings, while carrying loads it wasn't designed to handle. Oil temperature was climbing steadily, and several minor system failures were cascading into more serious problems. The hydraulic situation was becoming critical, with primary system pressure dropping below minimum operational levels and backup systems struggling to maintain basic flight controls. Sarah was now flying largely through manual trim and careful power management, skills that most modern pilots never developed because their aircraft's automated systems made such techniques unnecessary. "Tank, I'm getting close to the clearing you identified, but I can see vehicle movement on the road about a click to the west. Looks like reinforcements are arriving." Sarah swung her targeting pod toward the road Harrison had identified, confirming his assessment. A convoy of 3 vehicles was approaching the extraction area, and thermal imaging suggested they were carrying additional personnel and heavy weapons. The Taliban forces were adapting to the changing tactical situation, bringing in reinforcements to prevent Harrison's escape and possibly to engage the helicopter assets that would eventually arrive for pickup. Viper lead, I see them. Continue moving toward the clearing, but be prepared to take cover when I engage the convoy. Sarah's tactical situation was becoming increasingly desperate. She had 3 missiles remaining, an aircraft that was falling apart around her, and enemy reinforcements arriving faster than friendly rescue assets. The mathematics of the engagement were simple. She didn't have enough weapons to deal with all the threats, and her aircraft probably couldn't survive another high-stress maneuvering engagement. What she did have was knowledge, creativity, and an absolute determination to bring Harrison home alive. The combination of those factors was about to produce one of the most innovative tactical solutions in the history of close air support operations. Instead of attacking the convoy directly, Sarah decided to use her missiles to create a landslide that would block the road and prevent the vehicles from reaching the extraction area. The technique required precise placement of warheads against specific geological features, an understanding of explosive effects that went far beyond normal pilot training, and timing that would have to be absolutely perfect. Sarah studied the terrain around the convoy's route, identifying a section of road that passed beneath an unstable slope covered with loose rock and debris. 2 missiles, properly placed and timed, could bring down enough material to block the road for hours and possibly bury the convoy entirely. Viper lead, take cover now. Things are about to get loud. Sarah fired her first missile at the base of the slope above the convoy, targeting a section where geological stress had already created visible cracks in the rock face. The explosion sent tons of debris cascading down the mountainside, creating a thunderous roar that echoed through the valley and shook the ground for miles around. Before the dust had settled from the first impact, Sarah fired her second missile at a point higher up the slope, where the initial explosion had destabilized additional rock formations. The second detonation triggered a massive secondary landslide that completely buried the section of road where the convoy had been traveling. "Holy shit, Tank," Harrison transmitted, awe evident in his voice despite his situation. "That was the most amazing thing I've ever seen. The entire mountainside just came down on those guys." Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction as she confirmed, through her targeting pod, that the road was completely blocked and no vehicle movement was visible in the area. The technique had worked perfectly, eliminating a significant threat, while conserving her remaining missile for other emergencies that might develop. But success came at a cost that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The stress of the missile launches and subsequent maneuvering had pushed her failing systems beyond their remaining margins. Hydraulic pressure was now below minimum. Safe levels, the starboard engine was running dangerously hot, and several warning lights indicated failures in systems that she couldn't afford to lose. "Viper lead, what's your status and position?" "Almost to the clearing, maybe 10 more minutes." "Tank, I don't know how to thank you for this. I know I've been a complete asshole to you, and you had every right to leave me here to die." The unexpected apology caught Sarah off guard, coming as it did from someone who'd spent months making sure she understood her place in the squadron's hierarchy. But this wasn't the time for recriminations or emotional reconciliation. Harrison was still in danger, and her aircraft was still falling apart around her. "Viper lead, save the speeches for when we're both back at base. Just focus on getting to that clearing." As Harrison made his final approach to the extraction point, Sarah received the radio call she'd been waiting for since the crisis began. "Hog 01, this is Rescue 23. We're inbound your area for pickup of Viper lead. What's your tactical situation?" The rescue helicopter was still 30 minutes out, but its arrival would mark the beginning of the final phase of the operation. Sarah quickly briefed the rescue crew on the current tactical situation, the location of known enemy forces, and the various obstacles they would face during the pickup operation. Rescue 23, be advised that the landing zone is secure at this time, but scattered enemy forces are still in the area. I've got 1 missile remaining and enough fuel for approximately 20 more minutes on station. Copy. Hoggo 1, we're also bringing 2 Apache gunships for escort, so you'll have additional fire support available once we arrive. The news of additional air support should have been reassuring, but Sarah found herself focused on a more immediate problem. Her fuel state was becoming critical, not because of normal consumption, but because of the increased fuel flow required to keep her remaining engine operating under abnormal load conditions. She might not have 20 minutes of station time remaining, regardless of what her fuel gauges indicated. Viper lead, Rescue 23 is 30 minutes out with Apache escort. You need to get to that clearing and be ready for immediate pickup when they arrive. Copy, I'm almost there. Tank, what about you? Your engine sounds like it's getting worse. Harrison's observation was accurate. The starboard engine was now producing sounds that no engine should make, with temperature and pressure readings that indicated imminent failure. Sarah was flying on borrowed time, and everyone involved in the operation knew it. Viper lead, I'll be fine. Just focus on getting picked up. As Harrison reached the extraction clearing and began preparing for helicopter pickup, Sarah settled into the most challenging phase of her mission, maintaining overwatch with a dying aircraft while coordinating a complex rescue operation in hostile territory. The next 30 minutes would require every skill she developed during her career, and probably some that she hadn't known she possessed. But for the first time since the crisis began, Sarah felt confident that everyone was going home alive. Harrison was in position for pickup, rescue assets were inbound, and she had just enough aircraft capability remaining to provide cover until the operation was complete. What she couldn't have anticipated was that the Taliban forces had one final surprise waiting, and that her greatest test as a pilot was still ahead of her. The enemy's last card would force her to attempt something that no A-10 pilot had ever done in combat, using techniques that existed only in theory and desperation. The impossible was about to become inevitable, and Sarah Tank Mitchell was about to discover what happened when quiet competence met overwhelming odds in the unforgiving skies above Afghanistan. The distinctive whop-whop of helicopter rotors echoed through the Korangal Valley as Rescue 23 approached the extraction point, flanked by 2 Apache gunships whose sleek profiles cut through the afternoon haze like mechanical hawks. Sarah monitored the rescue frequency while maintaining her orbit above Harrison's position, her starboard engine now producing a symphony of mechanical distress that spoke of imminent catastrophic failure. Hoggo 1, Rescue 23 has visual on the landing zone. Beginning our approach now, the helicopter pilot transmitted with professional calm that couldn't quite mask the tension in his voice. Flying helicopters in the Korangal Valley was dangerous under the best circumstances, and everyone knew that this extraction was taking place under conditions that were far from ideal. Sarah acknowledged the transmission while scanning her instruments. One final time. Oil pressure was fluctuating wildly, metal temperature had climbed beyond the red line, and the vibration from her failing engine was making precise flying increasingly difficult. She estimated perhaps 10 more minutes of flight. Time before mechanical failure would force her to attempt an emergency landing in terrain that offered no suitable options. Viper lead, your ride's here, she transmitted to Harrison. Be ready to move fast when they touch down. Copy, Tank. I can hear them coming. Listen, when this is over, I owe you more than just an apology. Before Sarah could respond, her radar warning receiver erupted with alerts indicating that surface-to-air missiles were tracking her aircraft. The sound was unmistakable and terrifying, a warbling tone that every combat pilot dreaded above all others. Somewhere in the valley below, Taliban forces had revealed their final surprise, a sophisticated air defense system that had remained hidden throughout the engagement. "Rescue 23, abort approach immediately," Sarah called out. "I'm being painted." By SAM radar, repeat, surface-to-air missiles are active in the area. The rescue helicopter immediately executed a hard climbing turn away from the landing zone, its pilots recognizing that attempting a pickup under active missile threat would be suicidal. The Apache escorts spread out to begin hunting for the missile sites, but their thermal sensors were having difficulty penetrating the rocky terrain that provided perfect concealment for mobile air defense systems. "Hog 01, this is Apache lead. We need you to mark the SAM site so we can engage it. Can you get a lock on the radar source?" Sarah's targeting pod was already sweeping the valley floor, searching for the telltale heat signatures of missile launchers or the electronic emissions of guidance radars. The Taliban forces had chosen their position carefully, using natural terrain features to mask their equipment while maintaining clear lines of sight to intercept aircraft approaching the extraction point. "Apache lead. I'm getting intermittent contacts, but they're mobile and using the terrain for concealment. Stand by while I try to flesh them out." What Sarah was about to attempt had never been done before in combat, because it required a level of tactical innovation and personal risk that most rational pilots would consider insane. She was going to use her aircraft as bait, deliberately exposing herself to missile attack in order to force the SAM operators to reveal their positions when they attempted to engage her. The technique required precise timing, perfect understanding of missile engagement envelopes, and aircraft performance margins that she no longer possessed. With her starboard engine failing and hydraulic systems compromised, she would have only one chance to execute the maneuver successfully. Failure would mean death, but success would eliminate the air defense threat and allow Harrison's rescue to proceed. "All stations, Hog 01 is going to draw fire from the SAM sites. When they light me up, hit them with everything you've got." Sarah rolled into a shallow dive toward the valley floor, deliberately making herself the most attractive target in the airspace while preparing for the violent maneuvering that would be necessary to defeat incoming missiles. Her radar warning receiver was screaming constantly now, indicating multiple tracking radars trying to achieve missile lock-on. The first missile launch was visible as a trail of white smoke rising from a rocky outcropping on the eastern ridge line. The SA-7 shoulder-fired missile was older technology, but still lethal against low-flying aircraft that couldn't maneuver aggressively enough to break the weapon's infrared tracking. Sarah had perhaps 15 seconds to defeat the missile before it reached her aircraft. Under normal circumstances, defeating a heat-seeking missile required immediate deployment of flares followed by aggressive maneuvering to break the weapons lock-on. But Sarah's aircraft was no longer capable of aggressive maneuvering, and her flare dispensers had been damaged during the earlier rocket attack. She would have to defeat the missile through pure flying skill and an understanding of weapon kinematics that went far beyond normal pilot training. Sarah waited until the missile was committed to its intercept course, then executed a maneuver that defied every conventional wisdom about missile avoidance. Instead of turning away from the weapon, she turned directly toward it while simultaneously reducing power and deploying her landing gear. The technique created an aerodynamic profile that confused the missile's seeker head, while presenting a thermal signature that was dramatically different from what the weapon expected to encounter. The missile flashed past her aircraft, missing by less than 50 feet before detonating harmlessly against the valley wall. But Sarah's unconventional evasion maneuver had cost her precious altitude and airspeed, and she was now flying dangerously close to stall speed in an aircraft that was no longer controllable at the margins of its flight envelope. "Got him," Apache lead announced with grim satisfaction. "SAM's site on the eastern ridge is destroyed. But the Taliban forces had more than one missile system, as became apparent when 2 additional smoke trails rose from positions on the western slope. Sarah was now facing multiple missile threats, while flying an aircraft that was barely controllable, at an altitude that left no room for error, with engine performance that could fail at any moment. Apache 2, I need immediate support on the western ridge, Sarah transmitted while beginning another impossible evasion sequence. Multiple launches, I can't evade them all. The second missile engagement was even more desperate than the first. Sarah was forced to execute a series of violent maneuvers that pushed her damaged aircraft beyond its structural limits while the Apache gunships worked frantically to locate and destroy the remaining missile sites. Hydraulic fluid was now streaming from multiple battle damage holes. Her remaining engine was producing ominous grinding sounds, and several cockpit warning systems were flashing alerts about impending system failures. The second missile missed by an even smaller margin, detonating close enough to shower her aircraft with fragments that further damaged her already compromised systems. The third missile would have been impossible to evade, except that Apache 2's Hellfire missile found its target just as the SAM operator was preparing to fire. All SAM sites neutralized, Apache lead reported. Rescue 23, you're clear to begin your approach. But Sarah's aircraft was no longer capable of maintaining level flight. The combination of battle damage, mechanical failures, and structural stress from her evasion maneuvers had finally exceeded the A-10's legendary durability. Oil pressure had dropped to 0, hydraulic systems were completely failed, and her remaining engine was running on borrowed time that was rapidly expiring. Rescue 23, be advised Hog 01 is experiencing multiple system failures, Sarah transmitted with professional calm that concealed her growing desperation. Continue with the pickup, I'll maintain overwatch as long as possible. What Sarah didn't mention was that she was now flying an aircraft that should have crashed several minutes ago, held aloft only by forward momentum and her determination to see Harrison safely evacuated. Every control input required enormous physical effort as manual reversion systems struggled to move flight controls without hydraulic assistance, and the engine was producing vibrations that threatened to shake the aircraft apart. Tank, I can see you're in trouble, Harrison transmitted from his position in the landing zone. Your aircraft's trailing smoke and debris. You need to get out of there. Negative, Viper lead. I'm staying until you're picked up. As Rescue 23 approached the landing zone for the second time, Sarah noticed new movement on her targeting display. Taliban reinforcements were approaching the extraction point from multiple directions, apparently having regrouped after the earlier defeats, and determined to prevent Harrison's rescue. She counted at least 15 fighters converging on the clearing, some carrying RPGs that posed a serious threat to the rescue helicopter during its most vulnerable phase. Rescue 23, you've got company approaching the LZ from multiple directions. I count 15 hostiles with heavy weapons. Copy, Hog 01. Can you engage them? Sarah looked at her weapons panel, noting that she had 1 Maverick missile remaining and no cannon ammunition. The 15 Taliban fighters were spread across too wide an area to be effectively engaged with a single missile, and her aircraft was no longer capable of the low-altitude maneuvering required for multiple attack runs. Rescue 23, I'll do what I can. Continue your approach. What Sarah attempted next would be analyzed by weapons specialists for years afterward, not because it represented conventional tactical thinking, but because it demonstrated the kind of creative problem-solving that emerges when competent people face impossible situations. Instead of trying to attack the Taliban fighters directly, she used her final missile to create a diversion that would disrupt their assault on the landing zone. Sarah fired her last Maverick at a fuel dump that intelligence reports had indicated was located in a cave system approximately 1 kilometer from the extraction point. The resulting explosion was spectacular, sending a fireball hundreds of feet into the air and creating a psychological shock that caused the approaching Taliban fighters to assume they were under attack by additional aircraft. The diversion worked perfectly. The 15 fighters immediately took cover and began searching the sky for additional threats, abandoning their coordinated advance on the landing zone, just as Rescue 23 was touching down to collect Harrison. "Viper lead is secure," the rescue pilot reported. "Lifting off now." But Sarah's satisfaction at successfully completing the rescue mission was short-lived. Her engine chose that moment to seize completely, transforming her aircraft from a marginally controllable machine into a 30,000-pound glider with the aerodynamic characteristics of a flying brick. The sudden loss of power was accompanied by a grinding crash that shook the entire airframe, followed by the ominous silence that indicated complete mechanical failure. "Mayday, mayday. HOG-01 has lost all engine power," Sarah transmitted with the practiced calm of someone who had trained for this exact emergency countless times. "I'm attempting a dead-stick landing, but I'm not optimistic about finding suitable terrain." The Corindal Valley offered very few options for emergency landings under the best circumstances, and Sarah's circumstances were far from ideal. She was flying an unpowered aircraft with failed hydraulics, minimal control authority, and rapidly decreasing altitude over terrain that consisted primarily of rocky slopes, narrow ravines, and areas controlled by hostile forces. "HOG-01, this is Apache lead. We're moving to provide cover for your emergency landing. What's your intended touchdown point?" Sarah scanned the terrain below, looking for anything that might qualify as a survivable landing site. The mathematics of powerless flight were unforgiving. She had perhaps 3 minutes of gliding time before impact, and every second of indecision reduced her already limited options. "Apache lead, I'm going to try for the riverbed about 2 clicks. Northeast of the extraction point. It's the only clear area within gliding range." The riverbed was far from ideal, consisting of rocky ground interrupted by boulders and debris, but it was relatively flat and long enough to allow for a survivable crash landing if everything went perfectly. The problem was that perfect landings were rare, even under optimal conditions, and Sarah was attempting something that no A-10 pilot had ever accomplished successfully. As she lined up for her final approach, Sarah reflected on the irony of her situation. She had spent her entire military career being dismissed as inadequate for high-stress combat operations, only to find herself attempting one of the most challenging emergency procedures in aviation while under fire from enemy forces. The quiet competence that had been viewed as a liability was now the only thing standing between her and certain death. The approach to the riverbed required precise management of airspeed and glide path, without the benefit of engine power or reliable flight controls. Sarah was forced to use manual trim tabs and careful weight shifts to maintain aircraft control, skills that most modern pilots never developed because their aircraft's automated systems made such techniques unnecessary. "HOG-01, be advised. You're approaching the landing area at excessive airspeed," Apache lead warned. "Recommend you deploy speed brakes to slow your descent rate." "Negative, Apache lead. Speed brakes are inoperative due to hydraulic failure." "I'm going to have to ride this one in fast and hope the gear holds together." What Sarah was attempting was essentially a controlled crash, using whatever control authority remained to guide her aircraft toward the least unsurvivable impact point while accepting that structural damage was inevitable. The A-10 had been designed to survive this kind of abuse, but design margins had limits, and she was about to test them thoroughly. The final seconds of the approach seemed to stretch into eternity, as Sarah focused every bit of her remaining attention on maintaining aircraft control while the rocky riverbed rushed up to meet her. She managed to keep the wings level and the nose relatively high, but there was nothing she could do about the excessive touchdown speed or the fact that her landing gear had not extended due to hydraulic failure. The impact was devastating. Sarah's A-10 hit the riverbed at nearly twice normal landing speed, with the belly of the aircraft absorbing the initial shock before the nose wheel collapsed and sent the machine skidding across the rocky ground in a shower of sparks and debris. The port wing struck a boulder and separated from the fuselage, while the starboard wing crumpled as it dug into the riverbed. For several terrifying seconds, the aircraft continued its uncontrolled slide toward a cluster of large rocks that would have completed its destruction. But the accumulated damage gradually dissipated the aircraft's kinetic energy, and the wreckage finally came to rest against a natural embankment that brought the crash sequence to a grinding halt. Sarah found herself hanging upside down in her ejection seat, suspended by her harness above a cockpit filled with smoke and the smell of burning electronics. Every part of her body ached from the impact, and her left shoulder felt like it might be dislocated, but she was conscious and apparently free of life-threatening injuries. Hog 01, Apache lead. Do you copy? We saw the impact and we're moving to your position. Sarah tried to key her radio, but discovered that the impact had damaged her communications equipment beyond repair. She was now stranded in the wreckage of her aircraft, unable to communicate with rescue forces, in an area that was still controlled by hostile forces who would undoubtedly be investigating the crash site. As she worked to free herself from the damaged ejection seat, Sarah could hear the sound of approaching vehicles and voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize. The Taliban reinforcements that had been converging on Harrison's extraction point were now redirecting their attention toward her crash site, drawn by the smoke and debris that marked her aircraft's final resting place. Sarah managed to extract herself from the cockpit just as the first enemy vehicles appeared on the ridge overlooking the riverbed. She was armed only with her survival pistol and whatever equipment she could salvage from the aircraft, facing an unknown number of hostile forces in terrain that offered minimal concealment. But as she took cover behind the wreckage of her aircraft and prepared for what might be her final engagement, Sarah felt an unexpected sense of calm. She had accomplished her mission. Harrison was safe, the rescue operation had succeeded, and she had proven that quiet competence could triumph over overwhelming odds when applied with sufficient determination and skill. The fact that her career might end in this rocky riverbed didn't diminish the satisfaction of knowing that she had finally been given the opportunity to demonstrate her true capabilities. For once in her military service, the outcome had depended entirely on her skills as a pilot rather than her ability to fit someone else's definition of what a combat aviator should be. As the Taliban vehicles began their descent toward the crash site, Sarah checked her pistol and settled in to make her final stand behind the wreckage of the aircraft that had carried her through the most important mission of her career. Whatever happened next, she had already achieved the only victory that truly mattered, proving that excellence didn't require an audience, just opportunity and the courage to seize it when it finally arrived. The sound of Apache rotors grew louder as Sarah crouched behind her destroyed aircraft, watching Taliban fighters emerge from their vehicles with weapons raised. She counted 8 men moving cautiously down the slope, their attention divided between her crash site and the approaching helicopters that promised either rescue or additional complications. "Drop your weapon and surrender," one of the fighters called out in accented English. "You are surrounded." Sarah gripped her survival pistol tighter, knowing that 15 rounds wouldn't last long against 8 assault rifles, but determined to make her final stand count. The wreckage provided decent cover, but her position was essentially hopeless against organized infantry assault. Then Apache Lead's voice crackled through her damaged survival radio, weak but audible. "Hog 01. If you can hear this, get down and stay down. We're coming in hot." The 2 Apache gunships swept into the riverbed like avenging angels, their 30mm chain guns chattering death as they engaged the Taliban fighters with surgical precision. The enemy force scattered immediately, some taking cover behind rocks, while others attempted to flee back to their vehicles on the ridge above. Sarah pressed herself against the ground as the battle raged around her, watching through gaps in the wreckage as the Apache crew systematically eliminated the threats that had surrounded her position. Within minutes, the firefight was over, leaving only smoke in vehicles and the echo of rotor blades against the valley walls. Hoggo 1, this is Apache lead. Area is secure. We've got Rescue 23 inbound for your pickup. 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself strapped into a rescue helicopter alongside Harrison, both pilots heading back toward Bagram with injuries that were painful but not life-threatening. As the Korangal Valley fell away beneath them, Harrison turned to her with an expression she'd never seen before, genuine respect. "Tank," he said quietly, "what you did back there, I've never seen flying like that. You saved my life with an aircraft that shouldn't have been able to fly, using tactics that don't exist in any manual." Sarah nodded acknowledgement, but remained focused on the implications of what had happened. She'd proven her capabilities, under the most extreme circumstances possible, but she'd also destroyed a multi-million-dollar aircraft and violated direct orders in the process. Military bureaucracy didn't always reward innovation, even when it saved lives. The debriefing at Bagram lasted 6 hours and involved personnel from the wing commander, down to maintenance specialists trying to understand how 780654 had remained airborne as long as it had. Luis Rodriguez sat in the back of the room with the expression of amazed pride, having witnessed vindication of everything he believed about both the aircraft and its pilot. Colonel Peterson's questions were pointed and professional. "Captain Mitchell, you directly disobeyed orders to remain in your assigned patrol area. How do you justify abandoning your primary mission?" "Sir, my primary mission was to defend coalition assets. When Viper Lead went down, he became the highest priority asset in my area of responsibility. Your aircraft was reported as mechanically unsound before takeoff. Why didn't you abort the mission when problems became apparent?" "Sir, the aircraft was capable of completing the mission. It just required creative application of standard procedures." The questioning continued for hours, covering every aspect of her tactical decisions, mechanical management, and innovative techniques. Sarah answered each query with the same methodical precision that had characterized her flying, neither defensive nor boastful about what she'd accomplished. The real breakthrough came when Colonel Johnson from Wing Headquarters arrived with a stack of reports from higher command. "Captain Mitchell," he announced, "the Pentagon has received preliminary reports of your actions. They're calling it the most innovative close air support operation in decades." The room's atmosphere shifted immediately. What had begun as a potential disciplinary hearing was transforming into something entirely different. "Furthermore," Johnson continued, "the Secretary of the Air Force has directed that Captain Mitchell's tactics be studied and incorporated into advanced training curricula. She's being reassigned to the weapons school as a senior instructor, effective immediately." Sarah felt the familiar sensation of having her career trajectory altered by forces beyond her control, but this time the change was moving in a positive direction. The weapons school assignment represented the pinnacle of tactical aviation, where the Air Force's most skilled pilots developed the techniques that would define combat operations for the next generation. Peterson looked genuinely stunned. "Sir, Captain Mitchell has been in my squadron for 6 months. Her performance evaluations indicate—" "Colonel," Johnson interrupted, "her performance evaluations are clearly inadequate for assessing unconventional excellence. That's going to change, starting with her immediate promotion to major and assignment as Chief of Unconventional Tactics Development." As the debriefing concluded, Luz approached Sarah with a maintenance report that would become part of Air Force legend. "Tank," he said with obvious satisfaction, "I've documented every system failure, every workaround, and every impossible thing that aircraft did under your control. This report is going to change how we think about aircraft limitations." 3 months later, Major Sarah Mitchell stood before a classroom of elite pilots at Nellis Air Force Base. teaching courses with titles like Advanced Emergency Procedures and Unconventional Application of Standard Systems. Her students included some of the same pilots who had previously dismissed her capabilities, now eager to learn techniques that had proven their worth under the most demanding circumstances possible. Harrison, fully recovered from his injuries, sat in the front row of every class she taught. His public recommendation had been instrumental in her rapid promotion, and he'd become one of her most effective advocates within the fighter pilot community. The key principle, Sarah explained to her current class, is that aircraft limitations are usually assumptions rather than absolutes. Every system has capabilities beyond its documented parameters, if you understand how to access them safely. Captain Lisa Chun raised her hand. Major, how do you develop that kind of systems knowledge? Most of us never have time for that level of detailed study. Sarah smiled, remembering her own struggles with finding time for the preparation that others considered unnecessary. Captain, excellence in any field requires preparation that others aren't willing to undertake. You find the time by understanding that your life, and the lives of others, may depend on knowledge that seems irrelevant during routine operations. The transformation extended beyond Sarah's personal career. Her innovations had sparked a service-wide review of training curricula, aircraft utilization policies, and performance evaluation standards. The Mitchell protocols were now standard emergency procedures, and her techniques for extracting maximum performance from damaged aircraft had saved dozens of lives across multiple theaters of operation. Louise had been promoted to Chief Master Sergeant and assigned as her senior maintenance advisor, finally receiving recognition for insights that had been overlooked for years. Together, they developed new approaches to aircraft preparation and pilot-maintainer cooperation that revolutionized squadron operations, but perhaps the most significant change was cultural. The Air Force had begun recognizing that excellence came in many forms, and that quiet competence could be just as valuable as flashy demonstration. Performance evaluations now included criteria for innovative thinking and problem-solving under stress, rather than focusing exclusively on aggressive tactics and traditional leadership styles. Sarah's final vindication came during a ceremony at the Pentagon, where she received the Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions in the Korangal Valley. As she stood at attention while the citation was read, she thought about the long journey from overlooked backup pilot to recognized innovator. Captain Mitchell's actions exemplify the highest traditions of military aviation, the citation concluded. Her innovative tactics, exceptional airmanship, and selfless dedication to mission accomplishment under impossible circumstances serve as an inspiration to all who serve. After the ceremony, General Patricia Hayes approached with a personal message from the Chief of Staff. "Major Mitchell," she said, "the Air Force owes you an apology. We nearly lost one of our most valuable assets by failing to recognize unconventional excellence. That won't happen again." Sarah's response was characteristically measured. "General, the system worked exactly as it should have. It just took longer than usual to reach the right conclusion." 6 months later, Sarah received a letter from a young lieutenant at Bagram, assigned to fly the same patrol missions that had once defined her own career. The letter described how the lieutenant had used Mitchell protocols to successfully complete an emergency extraction under impossible conditions, bringing home a special operations team that would otherwise have been lost. "Major Mitchell," the letter concluded, "I wanted you to know that what you did continues to save lives. You proved that excellence doesn't need recognition to be real, but recognition helps it spread to others who need it." Sarah filed the letter with dozens of others she'd received from pilots around the world, each describing how her techniques had made the difference between success and failure in critical situations. It was the kind of legacy that couldn't be measured in awards or promotions, but represented the true value of refusing to accept limitations imposed by others. As she prepared for her next assignment, Leading a joint NATO working group on advanced tactical development, Sarah reflected on the unlikely path that had brought her from squadron outcast to international expert. The journey had required patience, preparation, and an absolute refusal to accept that quiet competence was somehow inferior to loud confidence. The backup pilot had become the example that others followed, proving that sometimes the most important victories were won not through dramatic demonstration but through steady excellence that couldn't be ignored when circumstances demanded results. The future belonged to those who understood that true strength came from preparation rather than performance, knowledge rather than bravado, and substance rather than style. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.